are discussing Syria, where violence has escalated in recent days. A quick reminder of our guest tonight. In Beirut tonight, Nadim Houri is from Human Rights Watch. He's the senior researcher on Syria and Lebanon. In the US, Josh Landis is director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Patrick Seal is a journalist and an author of The Struggle for Arab Independence. And here in the studio is Majd Eid. He's a Syrian activist. Thanks to you all for being with us. I'd like to go back to you, Patrick, and see if you wanted to respond to what Majd was saying before the break, that you can't call what's happening in Syria right now disorganised and bad management, that this is, in fact, very organised killing.
Well, I think he must have misheard me, because I didn't say the figure I quoted for the number killed was 2,000 plus. I added that there were also 1 or 2 or 3 or possibly 500 members of the security services killed as well. Now, I think all of us here agree that what's happening is the most terrible tragedy. But I think we also have to try and look at it objectively. And my own feeling is that so long as the army and the security services remain loyal to the regime, it will be very, very difficult for the opposition to overthrow this regime without a great deal more bloodshed. That's why my own feeling is that the international community should encourage the idea of dialogue. The alternative to dialogue is a civil war in which everyone will suffer, everyone, the regime and its opponents, and many, many more people will be killed, because this regime is not going to give up, I don't believe. And so what I would like to see is countries like Turkey, and of course some of the Western countries as well, joining in creating a framework for a dialogue in which, of course, the killings would have to stop and a real dialogue instituted. That's what I would like to see, because the alternative is hardly worth thinking about. Of course, the other points which other speakers have made are absolutely correct. The regime has certain assets. The fact that Russia, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, and so forth will not allow a hostile resolution in the United Nations. The fact that there can be no foreign military intervention. The fact that there is still in Syria a sort of silent majority that doesn't want a change. They see what happened in Iraq, what happened in Lebanon. They don't want that sort of sectarian violence in Syria.
Right, okay. Let me sorry to interrupt you. Let me pick up on one point there, Patrick Seal, and put it to Nadim Houri about the armed forces. Why is it that al-Assad is keeping the armed forces loyal where Ben Ali and Mubarak couldn't do that? What is different about the Syrian army that means these soldiers are still following orders?
Look, I think there are a number of factors. I mean, first of all, in Syria, the high-grade officials are, many of them, a majority are Alawites, and even the Sunnis, they realize that their survival is somehow tied to the survival of the regime. Whereas, for example, in Egypt, particularly in Egypt, the army stayed in control. You replaced the head, but the core underneath remained the same. Same in Tunisia. But they realized that if Assad goes, they would have to be held accountable for what's been going on. So that's a bit different. You also have to remember that in the 80s, the army and the security forces played a very important role in sort of the crackdown on the protests at the time, which turned into an armed insurrection back in the 80s. So that, on the one hand, they think they're probably fighting for themselves. I think we will see more defections if this will go on. Whether they become, considerable or not remains to be seen. But there is no doubt that until now, many of the high-level security officers in the army have sort of put their chips clearly behind Assad. Now that does cause the problem that Patrick Seal is describing, which is if they remain loyal, then you're heading towards, I don't know if I would call it a civil war, but definitely sort of an armed confrontation at one point when the protesters, after being killed, after month after month after month, some of them, marginal groups initially will have to say, look, we have to defend ourselves. But I would say the guilty party here has really been the regime. It's very, and they have, I think one of the most telling examples is If they were honest about reforms, they would have reined in the security services, and this is not at all what we're seeing. You know, actually, the governor of Hama, for example, that was dislodged a few weeks ago, it seems it was because he was seen as being too soft on the protesters. So, you know, the security services seem to be really the ones running the show today, and the pillar, they remain, in a way, the only pillar, the only strong pillar of the Assad regime.
And we know, and it is very close to the regime, of course, because it's Assad's brother who runs the armed forces, isn't it? But what about this strategy of al-Assad's? Because he has promised reforms all along the way, hasn't he? He said he'll do things, and then he kind of takes them back. 4 different major reforms. He pledged a political amnesty. He pledged to repeal the emergency laws. That was right back in the beginning in March. He promised a national dialogue that everyone would be invited to. And he promised to reform the media. Is this a strategy he's employing to show, look, I am doing something?
Lying. He's been lying for 11 years. So why would he change that now? So he's been lying for 11 years. He lied for the last 4 months, 5 months as well. They stopped the work with the emergency law. The next day they killed 120. Then they freed some prisoners. These prisoners were not really political prisoners. Now they decided the law for the parties. I don't know really how it's mentioned. So it's all lies. It's all just to give an impression that he's doing something. He's doing a reform. At the same time, he's killing people. He's killing the Syrian people. So yeah, it's just to give an idea to the West that I'm doing something, and for the parties that are supporting him, like Russia and China, to say that look at the Syrian regime. He's doing a reform. At the same time, he's doing nothing.
Is that something you agree with, Joshua Landis? Do you think this is a strategy to appease the international community? Because if it is, one could argue that it's working quite well.
The Syrian regime is convinced that it is the best option for Syria. And yes, I agree. It has offered a number of reforms, but it's tinkering around the edges, and it hasn't said it's going to leave power. And that's what the opposition has demanded, that this regime leave power. And it's saying, no, we can reform within the context of us remaining in charge, the Assad family remaining in charge. That is not going to satisfy the opposition. And this is our problem. And really the greater issue here is how to govern the countries of the Levant. And unfortunately, there are no good examples in the region of democratic transformation. What we've seen in Iraq, what we've seen in Lebanon, what we're seeing with the Palestinians is a lot of bloodshed and great division within the country. Had Iraq, America said we're going to create democracy and there's going to be power sharing in Iraq. 8 years later, we've seen lots of killing and unhappiness in Iraq, and there has not emerged democracy. In fact, it looks like a growing dictatorship of some sort in Iraq, but we're not sure. In Lebanon, we have the absence of a central state, and the sectarian problem is still festering there. Many Syrians, unfortunately, particularly the minorities, are clinging to this regime. They don't really want democracy. They don't believe that democracy will end up with America or Switzerland. They believe that democracy will end up with Iraq or Lebanon. And that's the great problem. There isn't self-confidence on the part of a Syrian people, if you will, that they can manage their affairs. And this is where the government steps forward and says, look, I'm not going to bring you democracy, but I'm going to bring you order. And there still are many people that cling to that because of the fear. And that's the problem today. The activists say we want democracy, and the whole West embraces this because the West is about spreading democracy. The West loves democracy. It's the religion of the West. But we're at a turning point in the Middle East, and it's a point of great fear on the part of people because there hasn't been a successful example of democratic transformation.
Nadim Houri, what would you say to that? Do you think this is, as Joshua says, a real fear among ordinary people in Syria that this is bad, but a civil war would be a great deal worse?
Well, that's the problem. How do we know what the Syrians really, really believe? No one knows. And that's why they need to be able to express themselves. I'm not sure how Joshua knows exactly what the silent majority is. The truth is, we don't really know. And I'm sure there are many people who are afraid. There's no doubt many people are afraid of the alternatives. And I would be if I've lived under a regime where 40 years the alternative was said is going to be chaos. The truth is, I actually see the main card of the Syrian regime, which was always stability, they're losing that card because there is nothing stable about Syria today. Now, there are a lot of people, particularly the minorities, that are afraid of what the alternative would be. It's true that the opposition remains divided. But on the other hand, that cannot simply be a justification to saying, well, that should be the best thing. The truth is, I don't know what the Syrian people want. But what the Syrian people should be able to do is express that opinion without fear of being shot, being tortured, being detained. And I really think this is what it's really about at the end of the day. Democracy is maybe just they haven't even used the term democracy that much. What they're talking about is they want freedom. They want the freedom to be able to express these kinds of things. And only then, when the actually additional parties are allowed to exist, when there's a real free press, can we really know what the Syrian people really want. I'm actually surprised, considering the violence of the repression, that so many Syrians are saying, we know what we want, which is we don't want the Syrian regime, the current Syrian regime. For me, the fact that these protests have not only been ongoing, but have expanded over the last few months, and not in areas that have been historically known to be against the regime or to have suffered the regime, but areas like Daraa, which have historically been one of the areas that have supplied the regime with many of its senior ranks, or areas like Deir ez-Zor that have traditionally been allies of the regime, that these areas today are in a way saying thanks but no thanks in such large numbers, make me question the hypothesis that somewhat the silent majority in Syria remains the same.
Did you want to come back to that, Joshua?
I agree with everything that was said there. And I think Syrians, the consensus, it's not a consensus, but the alliance between the Sunni elite and the Alawite officer corps that has enabled the Assad regime to be so successful for 40 years in ruling Syria has broken down. And it's not because the elite has abandoned the Alawites, the Sunni elite. It's because the people, the pressures, the terrible economic pressures, the failure of Syria to grow at an economic pace that could give jobs to everybody, the terrible run-up in commodity prices, the poverty, growing poverty in Syria. And Syria is getting poorer at the bottom ranks. It's getting richer at the very top. But at the bottom, it's getting poorer. And that pressure, that failure of the Syrian regime to get jobs for people has caused this explosion. And the Sunni people at the bottom have abandoned the leadership, the Sunni leadership at the top. And they're demanding something new. And this is going to take Syria, I believe, down a whole new road. And hopefully what Nadim has expressed about this desire for a new Syria can be expressed without a great deal of violence. But it's quite clear that the regime is counting on big sectors of the population to stand by it, and we're going to see quite a fight, I believe, in the future, and this is going to get a lot worse.
Maj, is this threat of sectarian violence something that the regime has been holding over the Syrian people's heads for a long time, or is there some truth to it?
Well, Syria was ruled in a sectarian way the whole time for the last 40 years. It's clear, it's known for every Syrian that there is a special sect that is controlling the whole country that doesn't represent 10% of the population. And for us, for the Syrian people, what they want, the Syrian people now would prefer living in hell rather than under this regime. This is now really what the Syrian people are saying. And really they don't care now for all the details that we are talking about. They take about one thing only, that they need a hand now to stop the knife from cutting their neck. This is now the problem for the Syrian people. Discussing all of these details, who will come after that. The street is now producing new people, the young men who are able to lead this country.
But what about this idea of the unknown? Who's shaping up to be a new political force in Syria, for example? Because we don't see that as we have seen in some of the other countries where this kind of thing has happened. Does this opposition movement have the stomach to move forward, and does it have the ideas, and does it have the brains as well?
Well, about the concept opposition, when we use it here, we don't really have something called opposition, like opposition who is facing the region. We have a population, millions of people calling this region to go out, to overthrow this region. So mainly when we say opposition here, we don't have something really clustered, well organized as opposition. We had parties. These parties were totally destroyed by the regime. during 40 years, they destroyed all the aspects of the modern society in our country. In 1955, we were the first Arab country to have democratic elections, and we succeeded in that. And even the Islamists that we are threatened by them now, by the region, they lost the elections in 1955. So mainly we have the roots of democracy in this country. The people now are calling for their freedom in a very modern way, in a very liberal way. You can't see in Syria now signs of Islamists. You can't see signs of Salafists, as they are claiming. And even these soldiers that Mr. Patrick Seal talked about, that they have been killed. They haven't been killed by the Syrian people. They have been killed by the army itself, because they refused shooting their brothers in Syria. It's all, documented, this. We have films about this. Syrian soldiers have been killed because they refused to shoot their Syrian brothers. We don't have an armed opposition. This is not true. There is no one evidence that there is now an armed opposition. We have only the lies of the regime. There is no really evidence. They bring some arms and put it in the mosque, and they say that this is an armed opposition, or the... Yeah, that's it.
Patrick Seal, I'd like to bring you in here. We are running out of time somewhat, but where can this go? Because we've got the UN meeting tonight. Is this going to take outside help to fix the situation in Syria, or are we looking at a very long, very bloody conflict?
Well, look, we all want to see a new Syria, and we all want the killing to stop. However, I think we should understand that it is very difficult to move from a highly centralized, single-party, autocratic regime to a democratic, pluralistic system. In the West, it took about 200 years. It's not something which can be done overnight. That is why I personally believe that the best way and the best aim should be for a gradual transition to a pluralistic system. Now, this involves a dialogue. Now, to have a dialogue, you have to stop the killing, and you have to have a lot of external support for it by countries whom the Syrians can trust. Countries, why not, like Turkey and others. Perhaps even Iran might play a role as well, believe it or not, and certainly some of the Western powers, and certainly perhaps even Russia. So there has to be an external, I think, support for a dialogue. The regime has to stop the killing, but the opposition too must moderate perhaps its demands and not immediately seek to overthrow the regime. And I think that other people have confirmed that there is an armed opposition. There has been shooting. Guns have been smuggled in from neighboring countries. There's no doubt about that. And the external opposition is, of course, the most bitter of all the opposition. They want to overthrow the regime.
Patrick Seal, sorry to interrupt you. We're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time for this debate. I'd just like to thank all my guests very much indeed for joining us this evening. And thanks to you for watching. That's it, though, for tonight's debate. In a moment, we'll have the business news and the latest headlines.